what's driving that is the necessity to compete successfully in a global economy. Egypt in the 1950s adopted a 1920s, 1930s model state of centralization, etatism, a lot of state direction of the economy, and that reinforced and popular expectations that were already there as to the role of the state versus the people, had political consequences as well. That model wasn't working very well, and Egypt was stagnating economically as well as other ways, politically, by the end of the 20th century. The Egyptians realized that, the state realized that, and in the summer of 2004, President Mubarak appointed a deliberately reformist cabinet under Prime Minister Nazif. For the first time, they included in a number of key industries world-class business people, people who had run big, complicated global organizations intelligently, transparently, and up to world standards. Starting with that summer of 2004, they undertook very serious structural reforms. And they've been successful on the whole. They've been painful and stressful, but they have been successful. Since that time, since 2005, the gross domestic product of Egypt has grown about 7% a year, each year for 3 years. Foreign direct investment has come in, imports have surged, exports have surged. They've had a positive balance of payments for the past 5 years in a row, very positive balance of payment. Some negative balance of trade occasionally, but on the whole, positive balance of payments. And they have done well. Problems are that there are still important structural dislocations. They produce 600,000 or more new entrants into the job market every year. And to sustain job creation at those levels or above, they need even greater investment, foreign direct investment, domestic private investment, and government investment. They have not succeeded in doing that. So unemployment remains a problem. Underemployment remains a problem. Inflation remains a problem. And the little guys, the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, are really feeling the pinch, as everyone around the world is, in food and fuel prices. So they're grappling with all of that, so far successfully. Well, oddly, the agricultural sector is one in which the private sector and market mechanisms historically have played most. At the same time, the government is involved in parts of food production and processing. The state industries, for example, raise chickens and can tomatoes and bottle water and bottle olive oil and so forth. And that's actually the defense industries alone. They consider it a national defense prerogative. And this goes back to pharaonic tradition. The state has always felt a responsibility to make sure the people of Egypt are fed, and they do not trust to world market mechanisms to guarantee that. Do not fully trust. The bread subsidy has become almost iconic. It is something highly symbolic for them, going back to the basic, again to pharaonic times. The Egyptian dialect word for bread means life, aish. They don't use the Arabic word, khubz. So it's a deeply emotional issue. That said, the government knows it has to enact some reforms there so that it can free up funding for other desperately needed public sector services like education. The agricultural sector is doing fairly well. They have a particularly talented Minister of Agriculture. They have very good agronomists. They study agriculture in Egypt, have done for a long time. Cairo University's agriculture department has been there. Investment in agriculture has been pretty good. And their agricultural exports have been growing. They both export food and food products and import. In fact, the United States has a very lively trade with Egypt that's been growing. The main component of U.S. exports to Egypt are agricultural exports, and yet we also import agricultural products from Egypt. Even as Egypt itself knows it must change in so many ways, restructure its economy, open up politically. meet the aspirations of a younger demographic that wants greater freedom and democracy. Even so, the relationship between Egypt and the United States has to modernize, has to come up to date. A central feature of that relationship since Camp David, since the Treaty of Peace between Egypt and Israel in March 1979, has been economic and military assistance. The level of assistance was much more salient in 1979 and throughout the 1980s. At the peak, it was about $2.3 billion, including military assistance as well as economic assistance. And that, at that time, with a much smaller GDP in Egypt, U.S. aid alone represented well over 3% of the gross domestic product of Egypt. It's not counted as part of the gross domestic product, but that was the relative value. Now it's less than 1/10 that amount in relative terms. That is to say, less than 0.3%. And of course, the value has declined. The economy, U.S. aid has succeeded. It has helped the Egyptians grow their economy, open up their economy, decentralize a bit, restructure. It has helped improve governance. It has added a measure of transparency in the financial sector in particular. There's a very talented central bank governor. There's a very talented Minister of Finance, both of whom have used U.S. economic assistance to accomplish Egyptian goals of reform and opening up. The military likewise has used American assistance to sustain its position as really the preeminent Arab military force, and it is, of course, a force for peace and for stability in the region. It's vitally important to the United States that Egypt succeed as a rock of stability in the region, a force for peace in the region, and yet at the same time that it goes beyond stability and lets loose the dynamism of its people, that it opens up and that it shows the way for other states to reform politically and culturally even. So our aid has been important and has contributed. Since I've been in the Foreign Service, 30 years now, I came in under the Carter administration, the United States has always promoted democracy and human rights throughout the world. President Bush has taken that on with more determination and enthusiasm, I think, than any president I've served under since President Carter. I'm sure it will always be a part of our relations with Egypt, no matter who wins in November. The question for me is how best to do that, how best to promote democracy and human rights in any country, but particularly in a proud country like Egypt with a very strong identity. Remember, Egypt is not just any country. It is as we were discussing earlier, it is a civilization. It is also an ancient state. They invented states. 5,000 years ago, they had governors, they had bureaucrats, they had tax collectors, they had ministers, they had judges. They rationed out grain in lean years, they collected it in fat years. They had writing, they kept records. They had a sense of who they are. And Egyptians, while friendly to the outside and welcoming of foreign influence, do not like to be pushed around. They don't like to be treated as inferior. They know they've fallen behind in some ways, that their economy has not kept pace, that their educational system is no longer, the leading light of the Arab world as it once was. They don't need to be reminded by foreigners of all that. They know it. They want to do something about it. And their first inclination has been to turn to friends who have what they want, and that includes the United States of America, whether that's in medicine, whether that's in science, whether it's in education, even in art and entertainment. They value what the United States has to offer. And if we offer these things as friends and in a respectful way, always upholding our principles, we have to be frank sometimes and state where we have differences. But if we do it in the right way, always conscious that we're dealing with friends who are proud and who have much to be proud of, they welcome it and they respond to it. If we do it a different way and tend to lecture or even threaten, and for example, we talked about aid, we will punish you by cutting off our aid if you do not do X, Y, or Z, they close down and say, well, we're your friends, we're not your clients. So how we do these things matters a lot. We need to do it with great sensitivity. In need of improvement, and Egyptians themselves are the first to say that. In fact, in need of serious improvement. Egypt holds itself to a higher standard. It does not consider itself to be just any other African country or a backward country. They know what the rule of law is. As I say, they invented it. 5,000 years ago, they had laws. They have expectations of how the individual should behave in society and how the state should behave toward the individual. Many Egyptians now are deeply dissatisfied with the state of affairs. They are arguing among themselves very strenuously as to what should be the proper role of religion in politics, for example. How do you protect the rights of the individual and of minorities in a majority culture, in a very paternalistic culture? How do you move from an authoritarian model of the 1950s state to a much more open one, which brings on greater participation of the citizen and puts greater responsibility on the citizen? They're debating all those things with a much freer media than they used to have. And yet, most Egyptians feel the media is not yet free enough. They resent when the state tries to put restraints on, not only on the print media or on TV, but also on the use of the internet. Famously in the Arab world, including Egypt, internet penetration is low, but it is exploding in Egypt. It is drawing in the participation of young people. You can read all kinds of political thinking and cultural thinking, economic thinking in blogs left, right, and center. So it's an exciting and dynamic time. I choose to be optimistic about Egypt. They know they've got to improve on human rights and democracy. They want to. They don't need us to tell them what to do. Sometimes a nudge from us is helpful, if done in an appropriate way. But they have adopted world standards for themselves. They know there's a gap between their performance and those world standards, and they want very much to close that gap. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the Egyptians are keen to work with foreigners. They're interested in the outside world while being very conscious of their own identity and who they are. And if the foreigner approaches Egyptians in the right way, with as many questions as answers, then you find a very lively and rich conversation ensues. If there are any happy outcomes of the horror of 9/11, it is that the natural inquisitiveness and curiosity of Americans has flowered with respect to the Arab world, especially the Muslim world. Remember, there are many Arab Christians as well. And in my past few years in Egypt, I found many more young Americans and Europeans are studying throughout the Arab world, but especially Egypt, because Egypt is the most open to it. And they are thriving. They love it in Cairo. You're right, Cairo is rather the intellectual center for what is going on within Islam and in terms of the Islamic world's dealing with the rest of the world. There's a wide range of opinions. It's discussed in print, it's discussed in the classrooms, it's discussed in the cafes and in the media and on the blogs. Al-Azhar, which had been famously inward-looking, has opened up and welcomed in the past few years American teachers of English as a foreign language, so that Azharite students can go out into the world and speak in English and have some knowledge that goes along with the language of American culture and Western culture and how it goes. That's one of the ways we can engage, by having Americans go there both as students and as teachers in a respectful way that Egyptians welcome. It is a center for political Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt is still there. The state, the society, and the Muslim Brothers and other Islamists are all arguing with each other about how to deal with the role of Islam in a modern state, the role of Islam and democracy. Are they compatible? Many Islamists in Egypt are arguing that they are utterly compatible, and what is not compatible is democracy and authoritarianism or dictatorship. So they're all arguing. Egyptians are deeply, deeply committed to stability. Every speech that President Mubarak has made since I started listening to his speeches in the 1980s has focused on the primary responsibility of the leader of the Egyptians to keep Egypt safe and stable. And Egyptians do want that, and it is a core value. At the same time, they want to open up. They want change, and yet they are anxious about change at the same time. And along comes the great debate about the role of Islam. And is it good for stability? Is it good for change? Is it good for democracy? Will it protect people's freedoms? Will it protect the morals of the country? It's all under debate. There are no easy answers, certainly none that we in the United States can provide. What we do preach, if you will, when we're talking with Egyptians about this, is that you need the freedom to talk about these things and decide for yourself. We can't give you a made-in-America solution to these very difficult questions. There'll be a made-in-Egypt answer, and there probably won't be one answer, and the answers that you do develop won't last forever. That's the way of the modern world. It's not the way that Egyptians think in terms of eternal verities. But we say to Egyptians, you will find your way. And as you do so, count on us as your respectful friends with some insights of our own. In our country, Islam is a very important force. So is Christianity, so is Judaism and other religions. We have our way of making it work. Maybe there are some things we do that you might find interesting for you. One of them is the protection of religious freedom, of course. So we have these conversations, and in the most conservative places of Egypt, like Al-Azhar, they welcome Americans to hold these conversations with them. It is excellent. Joe Nye has written a book called Soft Power. It's a very important thing. I believe in it. We have tremendous influence around the world through our soft power, our moral standing, which is still strong, our engagement with people, our education, exchanges of scientists, artists, entertainers, etc. But in some areas, and particularly in dealing with international crime, of which terrorism is one, sometimes you need to resort to police, military methods. Sometimes you need to use lawful violence against terrorists. There, the Egyptian state cooperates with us in very important and effective ways in protecting our people and their people against violent extremists, whether it's intelligence cooperation, law enforcement cooperation, or military cooperation. The Arab-Israel conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, remains a central defining problem for that region and even beyond, for the broader Muslim world. Sometimes it's used as an excuse for other things, but it is a terrible problem to which the United States is dedicated to finding a solution. We always have been, and I suspect that whatever administration comes in, we will again be paying close attention, as we have been, to trying to find a solution. Egypt still plays a vitally important role. Egypt led the way in making peace with Israel, of course, from Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977, capped by the Treaty of Peace at Camp David in '79. Later, Jordan came in and made its peace with Israel. And now the other Arabs have seen what the Egyptians saw a generation ago, that this problem has to be resolved peacefully. There is no way to resolve it militarily or with violence. Israel is a fact of life, and the Palestinians are a fact of life. There is a consensus, I think, an emerging consensus on all sides that a peaceful, durable more or less just solution can come out, but it will be hard. It will take strong political leadership. Here's where Egypt comes in. Egypt is able to speak with both sides in a way that no other Arab state quite can. Gaza, the Gaza Strip, is contiguous to Egypt. Hamas, troublemakers, designated as a terrorist group as far as the United States government is concerned. We can't even speak with them because of the way we've decided under our law. The Israeli government has a very hard time speaking with them politically and legally, and yet they are there. Somehow communications have to take place. Egypt has stepped into that role. Who else can do it? If Hamas wants to get out of their Gaza Strip and speak with the Israelis, or anyone on behalf of the Israelis, whether over Corporal Shalit or relieving the humanitarian pressures on Gaza Strip, Egypt is there. Egypt is a sober state. It wants peace. It certainly does not want Islamic extremism, as Hamas appears to represent. Does not want that to succeed either in Palestine, much less in Egypt, and they do not want to see terrorism against Israel. So they are a responsible state who are uniquely able to speak with all sides to this. They are known for their, not just moderation, but for their calm commitment to peace. They are steady, they are stable, they are skilled negotiators. They can be difficult when they want to be, when they are opposed to you. There is no more tough state when they go passive aggressive. But they are also very skillful in finding solutions when solutions are there to be had. So they're a strategic partner with us for that. The world changes over time. The Gulf states are emerging because of their great wealth and are stepping up, I would argue, to the plate and playing a more active role in the search for peace and stability and growth in the region. I find this a very positive thing, and the Egyptians have responded in several ways. At the end of the day, from what I can see, and I don't speak for the government of Egypt, of course, but President Mubarak seems to have very strong and cooperative ties with the leading Gulf states. He sees them frequently, they visit, he visits them, they speak, and there is now a cooperation diplomatically that I have seen between Egypt and the Gulf states over these past several years with respect to the Palestinian problem in particular, but also in other things. The problem of Syria, the problem of Lebanon, what to do about Iran. That has been very positive. Yes, Egyptians sometimes, sitting in a cafe, will lament that these other Arab states that weren't even states 40 years ago, some of them have all that money and they're muscling in on what had been Egypt's turf. But that's not serious talk, and it does not impede the Egyptian national security apparatus, I think, from playing its traditional role. It's a conservative one. But they're there. They're still a heavyweight, and the other Arab states know it. They all consult. They're not going to move ahead, I think, and do something without Egypt backing them up or encouraging them. I choose to be optimistic about Egypt in 10 years. It has all the makings of a successful transition to a more open economy and a more open polity, with more participation by the people and still greater freedoms. I've discussed these things with President Mubarak and with other leading people who will go on. President Mubarak's term ends in 2011. He's just turned 80. He served his country in uniform or outside of uniform for 6 decades, since 1949. So all Egyptians know that a great transition is in place at the political leadership level. But when I say Egypt's in transition, I mean something even deeper and greater than that. There's a younger demographic. More than half of Egyptians are under something like 24. They have been exposed to the world in ways that their predecessors have not. They have enjoyed 3 decades of peace, and previous generations had not. Previous generations had been focused on war, wartime economies, the need for an authoritarian government to fight the enemy. 3 decades of peace have led a new generation of Egyptians to want something more than simply prevailing in an eternal war, against an enemy. They want prosperity, they want freedom, they want contact with the world, they want to read, they want to see movies, they want singers from all over the world, they want to travel themselves. And that means at the end of the day, they want freedom and more democracy, and they trust that they are mature enough to have it and deserve it. So I think they'll get it.